Let's begin the recording and also the live stream, Christian. I know it's already on, but in case you need to do something to officially start the moment, let me know and I'll begin.
We are ready, Asaf.
Good. Very nice to see everyone. We're going to study the emotional center, the function of emotions, largely reflecting from these two portraits of Rembrandt. These are portraits that we've featured before, but we're going to be looking at them from a different point of view. The numbers you see at the base of the portraits, I added, of course, these are the age in which the portraits are taken. The one on the left, Rembrandt, is in his youth. He's 23 years old. And then the one on the right is 63, 40 years later. Between these two portraits, we actually capture quite a meaningful span of time, because at the age of 23, Rembrandt was discovered. At least that's what the history tells us. So he would have been painting several years earlier, but at this age, apparently, his career took off, which practically means that some patron, some art appreciator, somebody important, in some circles, realized the talent of this young and aspiring painter and invested in him, probably commissioned something from him. And then from then onwards, of course, his works would gain more and more traction, and he would become a famous painter even during his life. That's not always the case, by the way. Many of these artists only get what is called posthumous fame, but not Rembrandt. Rembrandt actually became famous and wealthy. We'll speak about that later on, during his life. And so we have one milestone here on the left in this early portrait of 23. At the age of 63, 40 years later, Rembrandt would die. This is actually considered his last self-portrait. And so in between these two, we have a beginning of sorts and definitely an ending. We will be comparing between these two, largely studying the first one, the young one. And already off the start, you can see, even before we get into the nuance, and I will ask you, I'll be calling on some of your impressions of these faces, but even just a quick look, a quick comparison between these two shows how one is in the dark, and this is quite a unique aspect of the self-portrait, of course. You could even say it's a bit famous for that. He's in the dark, he's trying to look out through the dark. And in contrast, the one at old age is very much in the light. I'd like to start from that darkness and associate it to a quotation from Gurdjieff. Commenting on the emotional center, Gurdjieff says, "Man is at the mercy of everything around him, because he can never sufficiently observe himself at the moment when something attracts or repels him." We're speaking of attraction and repulsion is an emotional element, or at least emotional parts of centers, also called the horses by a different description. So because we cannot sufficiently observe ourselves at the moment when we're attracted or repelled, because of this inability, we identify ourselves with everything. In other words, from this angle, this is a portrait of identification. And let's start by examining this portrait from that point of view. What do you see looking at this face of the young Rembrandt, the expression he chose to capture on canvas? What do you see? You can either unmute yourselves and share it with me, or you can text it in the chat box. What do you see, Arjun?
So I see like a surprise and some kind of a shock.
Yes, very much so, isn't it? It almost feels, the surprise is almost tangible. The slightly open mouth, it's almost as close as you can portray this. Yes, because of course you can't portray that, it's a movement. But if you try to portray this shock, this breathing in, it might well, and if you have the technique of Rembrandt, it might well come out something like this. Surprise at water, June, would you guess? And again, we're using these, a disclaimer here, yes, we're using these as a lesson. And so you cannot really be wrong, Arjun, where I'm not asking you a historical question. Because what you see on the canvas is really a reflection of something in you. If it weren't in you, you couldn't see it. And so with no concern of the historicity, Arjun, what do you see? What would you presume this shock is from?
Probably seeing something that was unexpected, I guess. But I'm not sure, like, seeing what exactly, but I would assume that it's because I saw something.
Okay. Thank you, Arjun. Jim is saying fear, anxiety. And Jim, anxiety, fear, and early in life, yes? And here we can again take a little bit of poetic liberty and look at this not only capturing a moment, but a stage of life. He was discovered. He got the letter. He saw the sum of money that this patron is willing to invest in him. Oh my God, can I justify that? Or will it be a flop? Will I paint something and he'll go, no, this is, will I be a disappointment? Will my career be a success? Yes, a kind of a looking forward, all these identifications we have in our youth, we could somehow encompass them in this anxiety. Anxiety very much drives them forward. Myrto sees doubt, as does Susanna. Susanna calls it uncertainty. Kelly also surprised, caught off guard. Interestingly, Kelly, it's interesting to say caught off guard, yes, because if this were a camera shot, you could catch somebody off guard. But when it's a self-portrait, he has spent hours sitting in front of the mirror, and yet this is what he chose to capture himself caught off guard. That's quite something, isn't it? Artistically, quite ambitious to try and capture yourself caught off guard. But that's what he did, anyway. Oleg says, looks like a man who's just discovered something. Krista says, wishful. Tamara sees a lack of worldliness. What do you mean, Tamara? Can you elaborate?
An innocence, an innocence about life.
Yes, and there would be, wouldn't there? And definitely, Tamara, when we contrast it with the end, doesn't it? It kind of pops out. And yes, and we'll be speaking actually a lot of that, about that innocence that you see. Also, Shuaib sees today. Yes.
That look of startledness, it reminds me of my first experiences of spontaneous self-remembering, when suddenly it would happen and the overwhelming sense was, oh my goodness, I'm here, or oh my goodness, I exist. And that's what that look on his face reminds me of.
Oh, that's very nice, Hannah. It somehow, I featured these in all communities. This is the last community today. And nobody actually mentioned what you just said, Hannah. To me, it fits perfectly well. At the beginning, the state of real I comes as a surprise, almost as a foreign experience. We're so used to being asleep that all of a sudden when we wake up, it seems that that is the awkwardness and that sleep is what we're familiar with. And with time and work, ideally, at least that's the theory, that's the whole point, is that the identity, through all the efforts we make, but across years of time, the identity is transferred to that real I, so that when we have it, we know it, and it very much feels familiar. Very interesting in that respect, Hannah, to contrast between these two. I'd like to go back to the idea of anxiety and youthful anxiety, anxiety that results from inexperience. He doesn't know what his life is going to bring about. Will he become famous? Will he find the love of his life, if that's important for him, or not? Or will life be difficult, be disappointing? Will he not fulfill the talent that perhaps he believes or he kind of suspects he has? All these doubts and anxieties latch us on to ourselves, identify us with ourselves, giving us the feeling like our hands are on the steering wheel, and at the slightest bump, we may run our lives off course. In other words, we become very identified with the passage of time and with ourselves through this passage. Here's an angle from Maurice Nicole related to this. He says, with this identification, which sometimes takes the form of a continuous sense of worry and anxiety, the correct work of the emotional center is impeded. I'd like today to consider what is correct work of the emotional center. We have three primary centers. We relate them to three different stories in the microcosmos human being, the emotional center being at the heart or the chest, the intellectual center corresponding to the mind and the head, and the moving instinctive centers to the body. Of these, the emotional center has the largest scope, the largest spectrum of emotions. And that spectrum is very well stretched out, in my opinion, between these two portraits, ranging from anxiety, fear, and all these very really borderline negative emotions, emotions that are very much mixed with identification. It won't work, doubt, uncertainty. And on the other spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, well, let's hear from you. What do you see in this elderly face? We will come back to it later on. But just to outline the spectrum, what do you see here? What are attributes you see in this later portrait of Rembrandt? Aurel, what do you see?
Well, I see kind of detachment, and maybe he's thinking about he's looking at his life and thinking about the meaning of everything happened.
Okay. Looking at one's life, by the way, that is an emotional capability. Yes, it's not something the intellectual center does. I mean, it could attempt to do it. It would be very clumsy, wouldn't it? I was born here, and then I went this, and I moved here, and I studied that. That's how the intellectual center would do that. It would really not be very effective. It would take very long. But to comprehend, to encompass one's life, as I agree with you, Aurel, as you get a sense in this gaze, that is a emotional capability from the upper registers of the emotional center. It's something that only the human being is capable of. We don't see dogs and horses and birds looking at their lives, at the end of their lives, pondering at what it was all about. This is exclusively a human capacity, but at that, it is not guaranteed. And that's why we symbolize the spectrum of the emotional center like grapes versus wine. Grapes are not guaranteed to become wine. Only by intelligent effort can they be transformed into wine. And that will be the question today. How can we take our emotions, which in one way or another, regardless of our age, begin here, and how can we refine and transform them into something of an expansive or of a wider scale like this? The way we're going to do this is, and to make this very personal, we're going to feature similar portraits of yourselves, of some of you, of course, not all of you, that I've asked and that you've kindly contributed, of two ends of life, yes, of some of you. And I'm going to be calling on you to tell us a little bit about the young person in the portrait, what he or she were very identified with at that point, and how time has sorted through, has dissolved the identification and brought you where you are today. That will be the content of today's workshop. But to maintain, well, the observations obviously are quite personal. So we'll end the live broadcast here, Christian, with your permission, and continue on to our discussion. Thank you, Christian.